hope we don't have the opposite problem tonight. The reason being, I've presented obviously on Daniel many times, but I've never presented it in this way, and that's because I'm more and more convinced that the story matters as much or more as the facts and figures in the story. So you know how when you went to high school and they tell you there was a war in this year, and there was a war in that year, and this king rose up, and this king went down, but they never told you, really, what the stories were behind those wars, what led up to having those wars, why did one king attack another, and all those kind of things, right? And if you don't understand the story, knowing the facts really often doesn't do you a whole lot of good. So I asked you, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I did ask you to read through for homework, right? 1 to 6. So we're going to do a bit of a review. Last week I showed you this chart, which gives you a broad overview of the timeline of the Old Testament. And then I showed you that this is the time period that we're looking at right here. So the kingdom of Judah has been taken over by the kingdom of Babylon, and they are in exile in Babylon for that period of time. And Daniel was one of those taken captive. All right, so we said some of the major themes of Daniel were the rise and fall of empires, long-range time prophecies, God's interaction with all nations, the truth that behind all the headlines and world leaders, God is truly the king. So those are some of the major themes in the book, but we looked at the major theme, the one constant theme that's through the whole thing, and not just through the book of Daniel, but through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, is the theme of atonement or restoration, right? So atonement, at one-ment, God wants us to be one with him again, right? And I showed you these pictures, the left side being the original, the middle being the messed up thing that it became over time, and then in the hands of an expert it was restored back to its original quality. And we looked at the Bible in general, telling us in Genesis 1 and 2 that we were with God in the beginning, that was where he wanted us to be. In Genesis 3 we chose otherwise, and the rest of the Bible tells the story of how we lost everything and the misery that has caused. And Revelation 21 and 22 at the very end tells us that we will be with God again. And do you remember what we learned from King Hezekiah? Do you remember? He got sick, thought he was going to die, cried out to God, and God said he would give him more time, right? And in that time, he was visited by the king of Babylon. Different king, but same nation. And what did he show the king of Babylon? All of his stuff. But what did he not show him? God. And what was he told would happen as a result? So last verse that we shared together on that story, that Isaiah said to Hezekiah, Isaiah being the prophet, Hezekiah the king, "Hear the word of the Lord, behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and your fathers have accumulated until this day will be carried to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And they shall take away some of your sons who will descend from you, whom you will beget. They shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." I mean, really, if the whole purpose of this world is to collect as much stuff as you can, and you show off all your stuff to somebody else, what are you creating in them? The desire to have it, right? And that's what happened. So Babylon came back under Nebuchadnezzar and took all the stuff and some of the people. I share with you that Babylon was an opulent, beautiful place, and that's important because it's important to not see Nebuchadnezzar as some kind of Neanderthal or some kind of barbarian. He was far from it. He was a very cultured, intelligent man who created and ran one of the most successful empires that has ever existed. We looked at the controversy Daniel and his friends had between what the food that Babylon wanted to feed them and what God said about their own food, right? And then we looked at the fact that Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom was set up in a syncretistic manner. What does that mean?
In sync with everyone.
Okay, in sync with everyone. So what was he trying to synchronize? Right, because his empire was a collection of what? Nations, right? Small nations. He either making them surrender by threat or destroying them by force if they wouldn't cooperate. And he kept collecting all these nations, and his plan was to make his empire bigger and bigger and bigger, but to maintain peace amongst all of that diversity, he used the system of syncretism, which is you can keep your language, keep your religion, keep your culture, as long as, what? When I say jump, you say, how high? And then you can go home. All right, so now we're going to get into the stories, the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel, flourishing in exile. So, what was chapter 1 about?
The boys come in to Babylon.
We're going to have more discussion tonight, so don't be afraid to jump in. So these boys, these 4 boys, we know their names of, but we don't know how many were taken, but we do know there was many, because chapter 1 says they were 4 of many that came from Judah, right? What distinguished these 4 from the rest? They decided that God was still their king, even though they were in a different kingdom, right?
Yeah.
And the rest just went along to get along. You ever felt that pressure before? Am I going to be me, or am I going to go along to get along, right?
And they were judged.
They were judged. We're going to get into these chapters in more detail. We're just going to fly over them quickly here. What was the second chapter about?
Dream.
All right, so the king has this crazy dream. He can't remember the dream. He brings all his magicians and astrologers, and the list it gives you of magicians, astrologers, soothsayers, and all those things, all that is the heads of all of the major religions that he has accumulated in his wanderings around the world, right? So today it would be your priests and your imams and all those things, right? So he brings those in and he says, I've had a dream. I don't know what it is, but if you can do your job and you have connections with the gods, I want you to tell me what it was, and I want you to tell me what it means. And they said, can't be done. And so Daniel was still a student. His friends were still students, but he got so mad, he had a bit of a temper problem. He figured, you know what? Why should I have this whole department of my government, this whole religious department, that I fund, that I pay their salaries, and I have them in houses, and they live the good life under me, and then when I need them, they don't produce. So why should I have them? So he sent out his soldiers to round them all up and kill them. So they come to Daniel and his 3 friends, and what do they say? First of all, what's the problem? And then when they found out, they said, give us time and we'll talk to God and we'll see what he says. And then they went back to the king with their explanation, right? And we'll talk about that later. All right, Daniel 3, what was that about? All right, he sets up this great big statue on the plain near Babylon, and he brings in all the leaders from all around the world, and he says, this is my statue, and I want you to bow down. You see what he's doing? Why is he doing that?
Ego problems.
Partly. To ensure
That they will follow what he said.
right, I mean, he has the tense job of keeping all of these moving parts and all of these different cultures and all of these different religions and all these different ideas somewhat synchronized so that there is some level of peace in the empire. Remember Constantine? He had the same problem, right? He had the constant pressure of trying to keep as many people on his side as possible. And you had to move around your favor and move around your opinions and move around your whatever to make sure that the people were happy enough that there was peace in the land, right? Rest assured that when politicians get on TV and tell you what they believe about certain topics, sometimes they don't believe that at all. They just know that's what they need to say because that's what you want to hear. And Daniel 4, probably the most bizarre of all of them. What was that about?
Well, because of Nebuchadnezzar's pride, God said, well, first it was predicted, and then Nebuchadnezzar became very powerful, said to the nation, look at all that I've built. And God said, well, it's done for today.
Yeah, he had another dream, right? Called Daniel again. Did Daniel want to tell him what the dream meant? Mm-mm. What's that tell you about Daniel? He had compassion for the king, didn't he? Didn't want to tell him, but he told him. And a year later, what happened? The king was looking out over his empire from his palace, pretty proud of himself. Yeah, and?
So I had to put him on a health plan.
A little time out, eh? For 7 years, he went about basically as an animal. And God preserved his kingdom, probably with Daniel as one of the chief leaders during that time, until he got his mind back. And when he got his mind back, what did he decide? God is king. He was a changed man. Totally changed. Have you gotten the impression or the idea as you've gone through these chapters that Nebuchadnezzar is a man undergoing a lot of changes? Right? What was his reaction when the boys passed the test and were 10 times better than everybody else? He was impressed, right? Who wouldn't be? What was his reaction in chapter 2 when he was given the interpretation of his dream? Not just the interpretation, they actually told him what he dreamed. I mean, how would you if someone told you in the morning what you dreamed the night before, it'd freak you out a little, wouldn't it? What was his reaction?
God is real.
Yeah, your God is. Did you notice what he said? Your God is a God of gods. See, Nebuchadnezzar, when it came to his own heart, he didn't know who God was. He didn't know if there was many gods and some were stronger. He didn't know anything. All he knew was he wanted them on his side. That's all he knew. And then in chapter 3, how did he react when the 3 boys found a friend in the fire? What did he say? Yeah, and what did he say would happen if they didn't? So now he's convinced that God is God, but what's his heart like? You're going to do what I say, or you're going to die. Same attitude he had when he put the boys in the furnace to begin with. So now he knows intellectually that God is God, but he doesn't know who God is in his heart. Chapter 4 brings him the rest of the way around. Okay? What about chapter 5? By the way, you might be interested to know that a significant chunk of chapter 4 was written by King Nebuchadnezzar himself in the original.
His grandson gets in trouble.
Yeah. So this is the Bible says it's his son, and all that means is that it's a delineation of power through the generations, right? But it's actually technically his grandson. Just like in the New Testament they call Abraham what? Abraham is our... Yeah, he's not their father. Well, unless you count a lot of generations in between, right? So it's his grandson, and what's happening in the chapter? A repetition of what happened? Okay, so he's going back to be the same person that Nebuchadnezzar was before he met Daniel.
They're having a party in the palace, and they're using what was used in the temple to drink and eat from at their party.
Did you notice when the cups are brought, he specifically asked them to go and get the cups from the temple in Jerusalem? Did you pick that up? Did you notice when you picked that up that wasn't the first time those cups were mentioned in the book of Daniel? Did you pick that up? If you didn't, it's okay. Chapter 1, verse 1, I think it is, or maybe verse 2. It says that when Nebuchadnezzar went to Babylon and he got the king and he got the guys and he brought them all back, one of the things he brought back with the people was the cups from the temple in Jerusalem. And it says he took them and he put them in the temple of his gods. Now, what he did in the eyes of a Jewish person was complete sacrilege. But in his eyes, I am bringing their faith into my faith. I am making it part of my syncretistic system. I am giving them equal place in my smorgasbord of religions. But when his grandson brings the cups, what's his intent? I don't think dying a fool was his intent, but partying hard he certainly was. What was his intent? Why did he specifically, in the middle of his drunken party, why would he specifically ask to bring those cups? Yeah, I'm living high. I don't need this God. I don't know what my grandfather was thinking, but I'm doing things my own way. And when Daniel comes in and tells him what's written on the wall, what is Daniel? Daniel gives the history of his grandfather and all the things he went through. And then he says, but you knew all this. You knew all of this. I'm not telling you anything you don't know.
He was actually showing disrespect to the Almighty
Yeah. Defiance.
over and above his God.
Yeah. More than disrespect, it was outright defiance.
But also, too, they framed the gods of silver and gold,
Yep.
bronze and iron, wood and stone. So,
The God of stuff, right? Sad chapter. Saddest chapter probably in the book. And then the last series of stories, because every chapter is a new story, the last series of stories that God opens up the book of Daniel with is chapter 6. What happens in chapter 6? Oh, sorry, before we go on to chapter 6, how did chapter 5 end? Now, Tara, you said he was going to party hard and die a fool, right? When did he die?
He wasn't prepared for the fight that was coming on to attack his kingdom.
Yeah, well, Daniel and him were having the conversation. The army was already, yeah, it was already there. It was on the way. Right? He died that same night at the hands of Cyrus, the king of right at that point he wasn't the king yet. He became king later. Medes and Persians. Isaiah named him by name. We'll cover that a different night. Isaiah named him by name 150 plus years beforehand. Not only named him by name, who was going to come and conquer Babylon, but he actually said how it was going to happen. Walled cities. The only way to get in the city was either through the gates or through the river. The river went underneath and went through all the way through the city. There was bars that went down at the bottom of the wall to block boats from coming into the city without permission. And someone left the bars in the river open. And Isaiah said, because the gates will be open, Cyrus will march in. And that's exactly what happened. Before Cyrus was ever born, he was named by name and how he would do it. So what we're looking at when we read the Bible is what Isaiah says in chapter 46, I believe. God declares, I know the end from the beginning. There's no God like me. Nobody else can do this. All right, chapter 6. What happened? He did get thrown in a lion's den. Why would that happen? Okay, so what position was Daniel holding at the time?
Second in the realm. One of three guns.
You can correct me if I'm wrong. He was one of three or one of four? Was there three other ones against him? One of three? Okay. I couldn't remember if there was three against him or if he was one of three. Either way. And the ones that were with him didn't want him with them. They had a sense he was going to become not just one of them, but above them. And what was the first thing they did to try and get rid of him? This is just straight up politics. What's the first thing those governors did to try and get rid of Daniel?
They looked for fault.
They looked to find something wrong. And if you're following the U.S. election, they're all looking for something against the other ones to give them a leg up, to try and humiliate them, to try and debase them, discredit them, whatever they need to do to make me look good and you look bad. What does the Bible say they found when they went after Daniel? Now these guys, remember, these guys are tops below the king. They would have had access to every record, access to everything. What did they find? Nothing. Nothing. So what did they decide they were going to do?
Find something concerning his law and his God.
Yeah. They said Daniel has a weakness. One weakness. Quote unquote. What was his weakness? God was his weakness. They knew that when it came to his God came before anything and everything. Wouldn't it be awesome if somebody could search our hard drives on our computers, track us, put cameras in our house, tap our phones, and find nothing wrong, and then say the only thing we know that about this person is that when it comes to God, he comes before everything. That was Daniel. So they went to the king, and I love this story for one reason. Well, I love it for more than one, but I love it for this reason. When there's elections going on or whatever, people all get up in arms, think if this guy gets elected, bad things are going to happen. If this guy gets elected, good things are going to happen. But you know what? Darius was a good guy or a bad guy? He was a good guy. Did he like Daniel or hate Daniel? He put Daniel in charge in his kingdom, even though Daniel used to be in charge in his enemy's kingdom. That's quite an honor. So they go to the king, and they say, King, we have this idea, stroking his ego. For the next 30 days, nobody in the whole realm can pray to anyone but you. Because back then, if you were the king, you were not just a king, you were like above human. So the king says, that's a good idea. Let's do that. Why would he agree to that? It doesn't just stroke his ego, it actually helps to solidify the empire. It's the same as bowing to that image back in chapter 3. It gives the whole empire a chance to focus in and realize where their bread and butter comes from. He's the man. So they do that. The Medes and Persians have an interesting legal system. Once they write a law, there's no change in it. No change in their mind, going back and writing a different one. It's done. So they write the law and say nobody can pray to anyone but the king for 30 days. What does Daniel do?
Pray anyway.
Why does he do that? I'm going to ask you a question now. It's a hard question. I'm going to sit back and let you squirm for a little bit. Jesus said when he was here, don't pray in the street corners. Pray in your closet in secret. And what the Father sees in secret, he will openly honor. Daniel throws his window open when the law of the land says you can't do that. And defiantly prays to the God of heaven in the sight of everyone. Was he going against what Jesus said? Or was there something else going on? I see wheels turning. That's good. Can you hear what she's saying? Sorry for interrupting. Can you hear what she's saying? She said that Daniel would have known what they were up to. Daniel would have known the reason why they wrote the law. He knew where the target was. And he wanted them to know what? Yeah, and if you're going to shoot me, shoot me. But I'm not going to give up on God just because you want to shoot me. I'm not doing it. Anything else you picked up in that chapter? So after that, what happens? He prays. He gets arrested. King finds out. What's his reaction? Oops. You ever made a decision that had consequences you never even thought of? Oops. He was upset. No, he got his best legal people. He tried everything he could to try and worm his way out of what he did. He was trapped.
And he recognized that those that he relied on trapped him.
So he has to put Daniel against his own wishes. Sometimes kings aren't even free to do what they want to do. So when political people make mistakes, sometimes it's not even of their own wishes. It's just the way the system works. Puts Daniel in the lion's den. Comes rushing back the next morning. Has it opened up. And what's he say? Daniel was your... He knew the only hope that Daniel had was the God that he refused to stop praying to, even when it was against the law. And was he alive?
Yeah.
He was alive. All right.
It's interesting what Daniel said to him. O king, live forever. He was respectful in
Yeah.
that kind of a situation.
He would have known, too, that the king was put in that situation unwillingly, right?
Yeah, he probably didn't say, Daniel, I don't want to have to live forever. I have to look big and also.
Yep. Did you get the sense through the 6 chapters there's a lot of tension in that book of Daniel? A lot of tension between what? Good and evil. It's one way to express it. Between what I know I should do and what culture wants me to do, expects me to do, is even willing to force me to do. And the pressure's not just on Daniel either. It's on the kings, it's on everybody. All right, so we looked at the 6 chapters and 6 stories. Now what? Now we're going to answer some questions. Some harder questions. So we said the overall book is about restoration, right? So chapter 1, God's work, God's restoration at work through captivity. How is God going to restore his people and restore the earth back to himself by allowing his own people to be taken captive, his temple to be desecrated, and his nation destroyed? How in the world does that factor into God's work of restoring people? Or does it?
So they had nothing else to rely on but God. So they're kind of, in a way, forced to turn back to their father in heaven, having to save them from.
That's certainly part of it. I mean, those boys, do you know how long of a walk it was from Jerusalem to Babylon? What's the longest walk anyone here has ever taken? I walked 22 kilometers once. That's the longest I've walked. It was a 2-month walk. That's a lot of time to think. And they knew when they got there, they were going to have to decide, am I going to be a son of Abraham or am I going to be a Babylonian? And what did chapter 1 say about Daniel? He purposed in his heart he was going to remain a son of Abraham. What's God up to, though? So that's one thing. He's exposing his own people to make a choice. Now that they're out of the comfortableness of Jerusalem and they're not in the culture of their people and they're totally exposed, now they have to make a decision. Am I going to be an Israelite when it's inconvenient or am I not? So that's definitely one thing God was up to. What else was he up to? Okay, so he's, by deconstructing an Israel that has gone pretty much completely wrong, he's able to salvage Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel. There are some other faithful ones that remained in the Jerusalem area. Anybody here ever restored anything? Car, furniture, anything? What was God's original plan for his people? The people that he built through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. What was his plan for them?
To reveal his character to the world.
Remember I told you the very first night, the best argument for Christianity is a loving and lovable Christian. He wanted his people to be such a kind of people that everybody else wanted to be with them, around them, etc., etc. You know your home is a healthy home when the neighborhood kids want to be at your home. That's what he wanted for his people, but they weren't doing it. Instead of building bridges to the nations, they built walls around the nation. And instead of calling them candidates for the kingdom, they called them Gentile dogs. You see, inside the walls, they had the truth. The Messiah was coming. But they didn't want to share it. They didn't want anybody else to have it. What did Nebuchadnezzar have that Israel didn't have? He had a kingdom. He had access to the entire world. My mom passed away about 5 years ago with cancer. She made the best stuffing. I've never had better. Never. And when I met my wife, Tracy, and she had my mom's stuffing for the first time, she was like, whoa. And I'm not the kind of guy who's like, oh, you don't make it like my mother. I've never told my wife that ever. I didn't need to sell my mother's stuffing. It sells itself. But you can't buy my mother's stuffing. Do you know why? It never went on sale. But if she had had connections with Superstore or with another major chain, and they got a hold of a recipe and they were able to reproduce it and mass sell it, guess what you'd have with that recipe and that network of sales? You'd have a winner, right? Nebuchadnezzar had the network, but nothing to offer. Daniel had the goods and no way to get them to anyone. And God brought them together. Restoration through captivity. When they thought the worst thing was happening to them that had ever happened, God was only getting started. Chapter 1, restoration through captivity. All right, chapter 2, God's restoration work through dreams. Doesn't that sound kind of sketchy? I had a dream. What's he up to? Bang. Was Daniel going to be able to get his attention? If I told one of you tonight that I want you to go and get President Obama's attention for me,
Not gonna happen.
not likely, is it? Not likely, is it? The only one who could get the attention of the biggest egomaniac on the planet, and rightfully so, he was a successful man and did some amazing things. The only person who was going to get his attention was God, by giving him a problem that he could not solve. It's called a burr in the saddle. God does it to me all the time. He just gives you an idea that you can't figure out, and it just grates at you until you succumb and figure it out and let him teach you. So he gets his attention. That's his purpose. What's he trying to tell him? If God had just let Nebuchadnezzar continue to live his life the way he was going, what would have happened? Maybe. Yeah, on the negative end, he would have done something really egotistical. Somebody would have got really upset with him and knocked him off or something. That's on the bad end. On the good end, he could have just had a successful kingdom, lived to a ripe old age, and died. Went down in the history books as a great and successful man who modeled to the world that the sum and substance of life is collecting as much stuff as you can before you die. Does God want more than that for him? And more than that for the world? Yes. So his purpose was to get his attention. What's he trying to tell him with this image in chapter 2?
There is a king of the universe that will set up his kingdom.
You know, really ambitious people have dreams where they think they can do something that no one has ever done before. That's why we have a Guinness Book of World Records. That's why we have people who climb Mount Everest. That's why we have races. That's why we have competitions. That's why we have sports. That's why people want to do something that no one has done before. And Nebuchadnezzar's dream for doing something that no one had done before was setting up a kingdom that was so successful that it wouldn't end. Yeah. He wanted to go down in history as the guy who started the kingdom that never ended. What's Daniel's dream tell him? Or his own dream through Daniel's interpretation from God. What's the dream say?
The Babylonian Empire would end and it would be replaced.
It's going to be replaced and replaced and replaced and how's it going to end? What's that? But what is it?
Crushing rock.
Jesus, the King of Kings, the chief cornerstone, the Rock of Ages, is going to set up a kingdom that will last. Jesus will accomplish what Nebuchadnezzar wanted to accomplish, but is humanly impossible. Okay? We'll get more into detail on that later. So God is trying to tell him that what he's trying to do can't be done, but Jesus will do it for him. Now chapter 3. What does Nebuchadnezzar do following the dream? We don't know how long follows, but was it a week? Was it a month? Was it 6 months? Was it a year? Was it 3 years? We don't know. But what does he do in response to the dream and the interpretation?
He builds a statue of gold.
The statue in his dream was what? Gold in his dream. Gold, silver, bronze, iron, bronze, and clay, each one representing a successive kingdom. Does he like that interpretation?
No.
No. And so he sets about to make sure that what Daniel thinks, or what Daniel's God thinks is going to happen, doesn't happen. Right? When Jesus told Peter, "You're going to deny me," what did Peter say? Nope, not going to happen. I will make sure it does not happen. So he makes this image, head to toe gold. What's the message he's sending?
I'm not going anywhere.
Exactly. My kingdom is not going anywhere, and you better get with the program. I am not going out of style. I am not checking out. I'm here to stay. And he made everybody from all over the world come, look at it, get the message, and bow down to the message. And everybody did.
Except for the 4 of them.
Do you think they all bowed down because they wanted his kingdom to last forever? Do you think they bowed down because they loved all his policies and all his ways? Why did they bow down? For today, he holds the power. So today, I'll give him what he wants. But amidst all those people that willingly bowed down, there were 3 who stuck out like a sore thumb. Did you notice that when they refused to bow, they were brought before the king, and the king didn't immediately throw them into the furnace, did he? What did he say? I'm going to give you a... Think about it, boys. Think about what you're doing. Think about the choice you're making. Oh, sorry, I thought you had your hand up. What does that tell you about Nebuchadnezzar's relationship to them? He respected them. He liked them. He didn't want to put them in the furnace. He's like, don't make me do this. But I've made a stand. I can't back down. So you better back down, because if you don't back down, you're going in the furnace. What did they say? What they said to the king is one of my favorite verses in the whole Bible. Yeah, king, we don't need to defend you in this matter. There's no discussion. It's not even up for discussion. You need to do what you need to do, and we're going to do what we need to do. So you better go ahead and do what you need to do, because we're not moving. Yeah. If God decides to save us, we're coming out of this alive, and if he doesn't, it doesn't matter. It's God's decision. So they go in the furnace, and what happens? I've heard all kinds of theories about how this all went down. There's all kinds of wacky theories people come up with to discredit the miracles in the Bible. But they went in tied up. How'd they come out? Yeah, no ropes, all gone, but you couldn't even smell smoke on them when they came out. The fire was so hot it killed the soldiers who put them into the fire. And Nebuchadnezzar's reaction? One like the Son of Man, or one like the Son of God, or whatever. Who do you think that was? Probably. You can rest assured that if God allows you into trouble, He's with you in that trouble.
Interesting that you would know from Daniel and these three what the Son of God would look like.
Yeah. It is interesting. All right. I think we're good for that one, unless anybody had anything else. All right. Chapter 4. Like I said before, probably the strangest of them all. Restoration through insanity. Is that what that was? Is God mean? Seems like making someone live like an animal for 7 years is kind of mean. I mean, if you went over to someone's house and they had their kid on all fours on a leash, making them eat cat food, and you said, "What are you doing?" You say, "Well, I tried to reason with him. I tried to reason with him. I tried to reason with him. He won't reason with me, so this is his punishment." What would you think? A little crazy. You know, we wonder why God does some of the things He does. But when you give someone free choice, but you love them like crazy, sometimes we limit Him and His options, don't we? Right? If you give someone freedom, they have freedom. You can't tell them no because you gave them freedom. You can't force them to stop because you gave them freedom. One of the most interesting sermons I've ever heard, and I wish I could remember the name of it because it was a long time ago and I've never been able to find it since, but it was called Roadblocks on the Way to Hell. And it was a sermon about all the things that God has done through history to try and stop people from the crazy paths that they were on. And this is one of them. Nebuchadnezzar is investing all of his intelligence, and he had a lot of it, all of his energy, and he had a lot of it, all of his ambition, and he had a lot of it, into building a kingdom that he knew he wouldn't even be around to see because he was going to die, just like all the rest of us. And God said, "No, Nebuchadnezzar, I have better plans for you than that. But if you won't listen to reason, then I'm going to take away your reason." So he knew God, he knew about God, for sure. He knew the power of God. What didn't he know about God?
God loved him and had a plan for him.
How did Nebuchadnezzar ultimately see people? When you see how he interacted, when you see how he reacted to the magicians who couldn't do what he wanted, and you see how he reacted to the boys, even though he liked them and respected them, when they wouldn't fit into his political plan, how did he ultimately see people? Yeah. All right, I'm going to do you in before you do me in. Now, somebody who thinks like that about themselves and their relationship to other people, can they comprehend a God who thinks of them in a completely different way? At best, he saw God as somebody like him, but with more more power. But God was nothing like him. And somehow he had to get that message across to him. How do you think he felt when he came to his senses 7 years later and realized that God kept my kingdom for me? I mean, how many kingdoms have been taken away from kings while they were in their right mind? Right? And God preserved his for 7 years while he was out of his mind and gave it back to him. It's amazing when you think about it. Oh, wait, we touched on this a little bit before. Why was Daniel so hesitant to explain the dream? Why did he not want to tell Nebuchadnezzar what the dream meant? He had the dream of the great big tree, all the birds of the air, all the animals came to this tree, everything was fed from this tree, sheltered in the tree, and then the tree got chopped down.
He's going to tell him that by the way, you're not going to be running your kingdom for about 7 years.
Yeah, you're the tree.
Daniel would have had a lot of respect for him as a person, working with him that closely, almost a loving relationship in a sense. And he knew that, number one, he knew how it would affect him, that with Nebuchadnezzar's tendency to anger. And he didn't want to rebuke him or be rebuked by the king. And it goes on at the end of the chapter there to say, please, Daniel says, please repent, please change so you won't have to do this. It shows Daniel's great concern and care for him.
Yeah, that was the other thing. Daniel even told him ahead of time, this is what is going to happen, but it doesn't need to happen. Right? So Nebuchadnezzar, when he came back to his senses, he realized, I didn't have to go through that. That was on me. That, now think about this. Think about what Paulette just said. Think about what was just said. Was it possible that when Daniel told him the dream and what it meant, that Nebuchadnezzar's temper could flare up and Daniel could be killed? Possible. Maybe the struggle between, I know this is true, but do I really want to give into it, right? So coming back to that idea, Daniel could have been potentially killed, but his concern was not for his safety, it was for the king. Who does that sound like? Who does that sound like? Jesus. He came here not thinking he could die, but knowing he would die. But his concern was not for him. His concern was for us. You see how opposite the character of God is to the character of Nebuchadnezzar before chapter 4? Nebuchadnezzar's concern was not for us, for his people or his kingdom. His concern was for himself. I take care of you so that you'll take care of me. I give you what you want to a degree so that you'll be peaceful and leave me alone so I can rule this kingdom. So last question on this one, we touched on a little bit. Why would God put Daniel in that position? Would you want to be in his position? Would you want to be the messenger between a God who's asking a king to surrender and a king who doesn't want to do anything of the sort? Why does he put him there? So God could trust Daniel there because he loved God and he loved Nebuchadnezzar. Do you think part of what God's doing in this whole thing we call life is helping us to see the world from his perspective? God, you wanted me to put my life on the line for him? Yep. Why should I do that? Because I did it for you. I mean, when you read through the stories of people who really came to understand God, people like Moses and people like Abraham, you come to moments in their life where they express the heart of God. They say, Moses said to God, spare the people. Don't turn on them when you're in your anger. Don't do that. Because Moses came to see the people the way God sees people. Not piles of mess, but piles of potential. All right, chapter 5. Restoration through intimidation? Is that what chapter 5 is about? Is it restoration rejected? Is it restoration through another means? What is it? So you've got a new sheriff in town, new king on the throne. He's decided that his grandfather's conversion means nothing to him. He's going back to rule things the way they used to be in the good old days when the king was the king and everybody did what they were supposed to do and he could run all the shots. And God interrupts his party and says, excuse me, I have a message for you. What's God up to? If his ultimate goal is always restoration, what's he up to? Yeah, he was raised knowing God. Yeah. Why do you think nations rise and fall? Our series is about the rise and fall of nations. Constantine series, Shadow Empire, was about the rise and fall of nations and the whole struggle to keep kingdoms going. Why does God, if he's ultimately in control, why does he allow one empire to last for a certain amount of time and then say, sorry, time's up, I'm passing you off to someone else to rule? I mean, the very book of Daniel, in the very first chapter, in the first verse, begins with God passing the king of Judah into the hands of the king of Babylon. Why does God do things like that? Was God at that point in history, in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, was he able anymore to communicate effectively through the king of Judah? No. He had cut himself off completely. Nebuchadnezzar, as angry as he was, and as controlling as he was, and as egotistical as he was, and all the things that were not good about him, he was teachable. And God taught him. And God used his empire to bring about as much good as possible, given the circumstances of the world. But when his grandson came along and had no intentions of listening to God whatsoever, why would I leave my leave my world and my people in the hands of an empire that won't even consider listening to me? So he passed him on. Chapter 5 is the story of restoration through another means. If I can't go through this empire, I'm going to work through another one. So when you see a nation struggle and fall from power, don't blame the nation that knocked them down, because that's not how it works. It's the fault of the nation that fell. All right, and our last one. Chapter 6. So a new empire, new sheriff, new kingdom, completely new empire. Does Daniel breathe a sigh of relief? Would you? I mean, think about it. Think about Daniel's position in this whole thing. He comes from Judah. He lands in Babylon. The king is a borderline tyrant. He almost loses his life right off the bat with the food. He almost loses it again with the dream. But little by little over time, he can begin to see God is at work. He's really at work. And in chapter 4, I mean, think about this. In chapter 4, the king, who almost killed him more than once, sends a letter to his entire empire and says, the God of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he is the God. He's the one. And so Daniel rides the roller coaster up to the top, and then Nebuchadnezzar dies. And his grandson takes over. And all of a sudden, right back down, worse than things ever were. And then the Medo-Persians come along. Things start to go back up. And then all of a sudden, one day out of nowhere, a rule gets passed by a good king that puts his life in danger. I'm going to end right here with this if you don't leave with anything else tonight, remember this. Your safety is not in who's sitting in office in any government anywhere. Your safety is not which empire is ruling. Your safety is not your job. Your safety is not anything that you see, can hold on to, can vote for. It's none of those things. Because while the empires were going up and down and Daniel was riding the roller coaster, his God remained the same. That's why when they threatened his life and said, you can't pray to him, he's like, guys, I was praying to him before you were ever in power. I've been through 3 kingdoms already. I'm not afraid of you. I'm not afraid of any of this. If I die, you'll actually do me a favor. And if I don't, my God will be glorified. But either way, I'm not changing. And I encourage you to find the God of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and get off the roller coaster of this world, because it's not going anywhere. Only God's roller coaster is going home. Kit, would you mind closing in prayer for us?
Bow your heads with me, please. Thank you, Lord, for the lessons learned tonight as we continue to celebrate our love for you. And we ask you to be with us as we leave tonight. Bless us in our study. Bless us in our continued search for the truth and for your love. It's so plainly given and so freely given. And so we thank you, Lord. And be with us throughout this week. Bring us back next. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.